I saw your interesting conversation between you and Westside Tyler about fascism and nationalism and the definition of socialism and all that kind of stuff. And I actually saw you reference genteel and a what I think is a definitionally close version of fascism, which I haven't bumped into anybody else who even remotely fucking understands the concept. So I wanted to pick your brains. That's why I DM'd you.
Sweet. Well, I apologize in advance if I'm very low functioning. I had like 2 hours of sleep last night, so I will try my best. But
may I ask why? That seems consistent.
Pollen. About this time of year, I'm a workaholic and the air is poison, so sleeping is difficult.
Okay, fair enough. Well, so I've always defined so what happened, just a little bit of a journey. I actually was talking shit. Oh, they can't hear you for some reason. The stream can't hear your guests.
Really? My
yeah.
stream?
No, my stream. Audio. Mic is good. Me, so. Headset.
My chat hears everything. Check if your desktop audio's off.
One of my chats says major echo on the announcer.
Who's the announcer?
I think when I was talking, it was feeding back into Sunday.
Oh, I might need to turn my...
It sounds crystal clear to me, so I don't know what's going on with you two. You know what? If you guys can't figure it out, feel free to just rip it off of my stream.
That's what I was actually about to suggest in my chat, is if they can't hear it. Okay. Go to President Sunday's YouTube channel. I don't have time to figure this shit out.
Well, if you go to what you can do is just go to settings. You can just raid me, and then we'll all be there.
Well, I'm using StreamYard, and I'm multi-streaming, so I have no fucking idea how to do it. All right. Anyways, I'll just end that.
All right.
We're live. Y'all can make money. I'm gonna chill. So, it's better if I chill anyways, because then I don't have to have weird people in fucking chat talking shit. So, anyways, so the political corporatism and flexible authoritarianism is the way that I've always defined fascism. The way that I got there was because I actually started my online political career talking shit about Nick Fuentes. And people were like, you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. You don't know what Christian nationalism is. You don't know what fascism is. You don't know what Nazism is. And I was like, they're kind of right. I need to go research all this shit. So I actually found Keith Woods, which is funny because
I know Keith Woods.
I was going to say, yeah. I saw a President Sunday video talking shit about Keith Woods. I haven't had the pleasure of watching it yet, but I'm interested. And he actually had a really interesting pseudo-academic breakdown of genteel and the concept of fascism. So I define it as political corporatism and flexible authoritarianism based off of my experiences with the dissident right. How do you define it?
Well, I don't know if you want to answer this at all, Tyler, for yourself, but for myself, I'll answer the question. What do you suppose the opposite of fascism is? I think that might be a good way to clarify
it. Probably hyper-individualist, anarchic libertarianism.
Okay, sort of. When I think fascism, I think of a political ideology that treats the state, that sort of presumes the state as the locus and height of human flourishing. So the human, insofar as that is a concern, is at its most intense at the level of the state. And so obviously, like with gentility, it's like it makes sense, throw away turn like human life and human passion and whatnot into a consumable fuel for state greatness or whatever. When I try to self-identify politically, I work sort of opposite that. So I adopt a position called methodological anarchism, which is a position I think even non-anarchists generally should take. And it basically works like this. You don't presume that the state as a social institution is specifically privileged as the site of either human flourishing or the ability to reinforce norms or things like that. It's perfectly plausible that it can be constructed to achieve those things. But you don't presume that the state as such is the locus of conversation when you're discussing things political or social generally. And so, like, one example of how this kind of works out is as follows. Let's say there's a good, actually, it's called methodological anarchism. There's a good paper in the Routledge Handbook of I think it's called Anarchist Thought, called Methodological Anarchism, and it gives an example of two states that are constitutionally identical. One's called Justitia, one's called Injustitia. So just Justitia and Unjustitia. You kind of guess where the names are kind of going with that. It's the one's a terrible place, one's a really good place, but they're constitutionally identical. One has like low crime, relative like equality. One has extremely high crime. Those things are awesome, by the way. I've got a green one. One has high crime and extraordinary levels of inequality and so on and so forth. Like any bad thing you can imagine, just sort of add on to Injustitia. Any good thing you can imagine onto Justitia. But the constitutions are identical. There are ways in which you can imagine that the constitutions being identical, and maybe we like the constitutions of both. There's nothing to criticize about them. They're very free, very like American style constitutions.
No, I can actually imagine this in America because we have a liberal constitution. And it is what you make of it, basically.
Yeah. So, like, for example, like in one state, in Justitia, there's no culture of mutual aid, there's no unions, and so despite the constitutions being identical, there's tremendous amounts of inequality, simply because there is no culture of like assisting each other and so on and so forth. With crime, there are other like social reinforcing mechanisms, despite the constitution being the same in Justitia, that aren't in Justitia. That means that the crime levels are very low. You could, as an example of like one very liberal thinker, actually, who's sort of operating in the realm of sort of urban theory, is someone like Jane Jacobs, who argues that rather than having more police on the ground, what you actually want to do in order to lower crime is you want to have like city centers that are very mixed, so that people are not just going off into the distance to go work and then coming back and sort of alienated from each other that way. Instead, you have people going to work next to where other people live, next to where they shop, et cetera, next to the parks and things like that. So that when, for instance, someone's getting mugged on the street or kidnapped or whatever, the people around see that and they have social ties. There's like eyes on the street, as it were. Yeah, things like that. So when I think of fascism, I think of a ideological standpoint that sort of presumes one particular institution out of many possible ones, onto which is loaded every single duty of securing security, welfare, justice, etc., etc. And I think that's mistaken, because I think it's an institution like any other one. It can be the most effective one, depending on like the circumstances, but it is one institution among many, and the conditions of it being effective are similar to the other ones as well. And so,
well, if you'll
please,
if you'll humor me a little bit, so I kind of want to lay out as I understand it, because I've actually had conversations with Culture Thug, who is another fascist creator. He's on like BitChute because he's been banned from everywhere, but people really hold him in high esteem within the dissident right community. Also, like, I've talked to Keith Woods one or two times and I've consumed some of his content. And I actually, during my conversations, I kind of challenged them to correct my definition, and they really didn't. They were like, no, that's about right. And so when it comes to political...
By the way, just so you know, I interacted with Keith Woods a long time ago, before I knew much about him. This is during the academic agent phase of my YouTube career, and he was critiquing the academic agent's understanding of Marx. I wrote that. That was me. Anyways, continue.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
So
not nice. Very, very bad, actually. Not a nice guy.
Well, he does seem like he can be kind of abrasive in the same autistic way that we value in this space. So I
mean, he's a Nazi, so...
Well, yeah. So political corporatism... Political corporatism, as I understand it, is that when you think of the state as a body, so for instance, there's going to be bones, there's going to be blood vessels, there's going to be lungs, there's going to be heart, there's going to be all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so what you kind of presume, you were talking about like you're no longer an individual, you sacrifice your individualism to the state in order to make the state operate at its optimum efficiency. Therefore, you're not going to think of yourself as an individual, you're going to think of yourself as a cell of this body that is operating. And so the way that I think a fascist leader would probably lead is they would identify all the cells in the body and basically be like, I don't know, the economy is the heartbeat or something like that. The brain is the government itself. I'm trying to think of other examples, but basically you divide up how the body
Political
works.
YouTube is the duodenum.
Exactly. See, he gets it.
No, I just wanted to say medulla oblongata almost immediately from fucking Waterboy. But the point is that you divide up the state into this thing, and then you can define healthy parts and unhealthy parts. And the interesting thing about fascism, as I understand it, is that it's often racist, it's often tribalist, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You could have a fascist government that ruled the entire planet because it would identify all of humanity as its like fascist corporative body, or you could have something like Nazi Germany where the political corporative body was just Germany. Now, the reason why that gets tricky is if you identify a subgroup, let's say gays, Roma, Jews, whatever, and they don't fit into your political corporative ideology, or God forbid, they're hostile to it. Well, now within the analogy, you've identified them as something that needs to be getting rid of. They're a virus, they're a cold, they're, some kind of bacterial disease or something like that. And as a result, if you've already given up your individualism, it only seems like a logical step for, at minimum, deportation and at maximum mass slaughter. And I actually kind of think that's the mindset of Nazi Germany at the time. I do want to talk about flexible authoritarianism, but I want to let you guys respond.
Well, I mean, just to push back on that a little bit, the reason why I don't consider individualism to be the opposite of fascism is because when you're talking about individualism, what you're talking about fundamentally is that the legitimacy of whatever institutional structure you're talking about, that is downstream from it having some positive constructive relationship with the individual, as in either it's downstream from like a social contract or something, so it secures like safety and security and freedom for the individual, or it's somehow related to the individual's consent or something like that. But you can absolutely have that and have still a fascist state. Just how it works is the fascist state partitions between different individuals. It's downstream from the consent or the interest of these individuals, but not these individuals. And it doesn't have to be along racist lines. Race isn't essential. It could be along any sort of thing.
Well, and I think a fascist, when you asked me what the opposite was, I was having difficulty trying to find the words in order to articulate it.
Yeah.
Because with individualism, I know a fascist would object to that because they would say that they don't see the struggle between the individual and the collective. They view that struggle as the perpetual struggle of society. And it's actually great individuals who are going to, co-opt and commandeer institutions within the society in order to rise to the cream of the crop of the best people who are going to lead us into the next great era. And that actually gets into the flexible authoritarianism part. So the way that I understood this is that fascists do not presume governmental institutions or historical institutions as de facto. They don't presume the monarchy is good because it's old, or the church is good because it's old, or I'm trying to think of another example. The military is good because it has power. They don't assume any of that. What they do assume is you have to climb up the powerful institutions that are a part of your society in order to gain power. And then you also have to use the institutions as they exist, the ones that you can't co-opt. You have to leverage what you can co-opt in order to maintain power as well. So there's this whole theory of righteous struggle of the person who can seize command of institutions, which is why, sorry, I'll finish this and then I'll wrap it up.
It's okay.
But this is why, Hitler, as you pointed out on Twitter, you co-opted democratic institutions in order to eventually arrive at his, was it chancellorship or something like that?
Chancellorship.
But Mussolini made alliances with the church and the monarchy. You would think that these would be contradictory positions within an ideology, but they're not, because the goal isn't what institutions you seize. The goal is power.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is when it comes to talking about fascism and a lot of political positions is that people try to solidify somebody's political position as part of the day-to-day of their existence, as though they've already achieved it somehow and they're supposed to be living it. for a fascist, they want to go into fascism, right? They want to push in that direction, but just because they are trying to push in that direction doesn't mean that they're already there. And so if you try to apply the rules of a successful fascist government, which are also, because fascism is itself a type of utopianism, it really just is because of its ideological basis. You'll see them. I think that's you, Sunday. You're getting an echo. I can actually hear myself popping back through.
Really?
Yeah, I can just see the green. I can see the green popping up on your screen. Not now, but anyway. So you try to like articulate. You're like, well, if you're a fascist, then why are you an individual? And I think that can really be boiled down to the essential that fascism is about achieving an ideal. Ultimately, it always boils down to that. There is a specific type of human that must exist, basically, and these are our type of fascist. If you are a racial fascist based on Gobineau or whatever his name is, that French fuck's work, you eventually arrive at National Socialism in Germany, 1930s, 20s, whatever have you. And so that is the individual that you're trying to achieve. And as long as you're trying to create that individual, or you're living as that individual, you are espousing fascism in your day-to-day life, which is why you see so many on-the-ground fascists really try to exemplify that uniformity, that conformity. Why, even greaseballs like Fuentes' Groypers do try to kind of put a bit of a military uniformity into their existence, because they're trying to show that they are the individual that will one day become the true collective of fascism. They're a seed as opposed to the tree.
This is Sunday. I want to let you respond as well, but I actually want to respond to this. I think that you're right that oftentimes people, particularly like rhetoricians or whatever, Richard Spencer, Keith Woods, Nick Fuentes, they have, and I think they will continue to basically accuse everyone of being a sleeping fascist. They think that like if you really admitted what your heart of hearts wanted, it would be to struggle in a similar way to me. It would be to acknowledge the problems that I see in society. It would be to, call black people this, that, the other, call Jewish people this, that, the other, call Protestant degenerates this, that, the other. It would be to seize power, but you just don't have the balls or the stones or the brains that I do to actually go there. So you're just asleep right now, and I'll either deal with you if you're a opponent in the future, or you'll be co-opted by me eventually, because eventually I'll succeed. Like they say, what is it? America first is inevitable. Like, I think that's exactly what they're saying, is they will either convert you or they will steamroll you, and you can't stop either one.
Well,
yeah.
Go on, please.
Oh, sorry.
No, after you.
Yeah, that's I don't know if you know this. I'm writing this thing on Starship Troopers right now, the novel and the movie. This whole deal. It really goes into. It's perfect to try to explain some of this stuff, but I kind of want to pop into it. I won't take long. But they are true. That is a truth, an actual truth. They're just kind of mishmashing how it's actually true. Fascism is always a potentiality, because humans, it's an aspect of collectivism, is a switch to fascism. It's the mob, basically, is the same thing. And everybody does have the capacity to become a fascist, which is one of the most important things to know about it, that really, if you try to collectivize in a scared way, a terrified way, a reactionary way, you will inevitably arrive at the same conclusions and the same realities that create a fascist actual society, even if it's a sub-society within the one that you exist in. If you are, for say, certain aspects of the online left, which I'll give to that conversation, you'll see little tiny micro communities that turn into these
predicated off of tankies.
Yeah. And they're basically, they do the exact same thing, and they say the same sort of shit too. And that's one of the reasons why that rhetoric resonates outside of those circles, is because they're not trying to convince you logically, and that's not the point. The point was never one day you're going to wake up and say, okay, I've sat down and thought about it, now I agree with you. It's eventually I'm going to find something that scares you enough that you will throw aside your morals and you will join with me. As a matter of fact, with all due respect, because I know she's a friend of yours, Brianna Wu typifies this kind of behavior.
Hey,
because there's one
Brianna Wu is a hero in this household.
True.
It's okay.
He is.
but she got scared and
well, no offense.
Sorry, I crossed line. I'll back up.
No, you didn't. You didn't at all.
Don't pull back that punch now. The dagger's in. It's too late.
Okay. All I was gonna say is that her reaction. I can spread that away out personally. Well, I was gonna say so if you wanted to say that mentality of seeing something scary and then fleeing in a different direction and then seizing upon the thing that makes the most amount of sense next to you is the attitude of most people who end up supporting authoritarian governments, I'll agree with you there. However, I think that her reaction to the far left now maybe sometimes is a little bit hyperbolic, but that's a perspective that I've had for a long time. I am a reactionary in the same way she's a reactionary. I'm just a lot more chill about it. I started my anti-far left reaction in 2016. She's starting October 7th, 2023. So she's got a lot of ground.
She's catching up. Let's go back to. I like what you said actually a second ago. So you said something like Keith Woods or Nick Fuentes or Richard Spencer. You all want fascism, or you're all like fascists or nationalists or whatever. And if you were honest or smart enough, you kind of fix on that. I agree with that, and I agree with that in this particular. I agree with that in this particular sense. Children are astonishingly cruel. They will pick the wings off insects. They will crush snakes with rocks, etc., etc. They don't have a concept's the wrong word. They haven't yet gotten to a point. It's not because they're psychotic or because they enjoy inflicting pain. It's because they haven't developed the interior complex that makes certain people value other beings and the absence of which makes other people not, or things of that sort. Or makes people love, for that matter. Like there's a very big difference between someone with a crush on a hot girl in high school and someone who's actually learned to care about another person's like thoughts, feelings, ambitions, hopes, dreams, family, etc. Henri Bergson, who's someone I've been reading a lot lately, has a really cool phrase. Maybe you'll hate it, but I find it really poignant. Philosophy does violence to the mind. Suppose it's possible that as organisms that evolved in a world to survive and to thrive in our environment, the way we think doesn't actually correspond directly with truth. And in fact, there is actually a sort of intrinsic, what we might call, shorthand, a fascizing tendency in our very perception of things, which disregards continuity and fastens on to, it creates even discrete objects that appear to be totally separate from the things around them, because that's the kind of thing we need to be able to interact with in order to survive. We need to be able to find this thing to eat, this thing to break, this thing to pile, and so on and so forth. Similarly, like I don't think it's necessarily a mark in fascism's favor that it's more consistent with the way in which human beings in nature, say, or human beings absent like some kind of civilizing process, would tend to sort of think or reason. I think that might actually kind of be sort of against it. I vaguely remember you having a conversation. I think you were talking with, was this on JStock? I can't remember. But you were talking a little bit about like, you might have been talking by yourself. You were talking about how, like, if you're talking about like what, let's say, God wants for humanity, or what morality is, you look at nature, you see what like animals in nature do. And animals in nature like engage in a whole slew of like extraordinarily violent practices as a matter of course that like would horrify your average liberal subject. They also engage in incest and rape, and they eat their own young and things like that. So clearly there's a discontinuity between the kinds of things that we aspire to and the kinds of things that are sort of would be sort of natural to us in the absence of any kind of society or civilizing process, or with the presence of any number of sort of like chaotic, traumatic events in our history and things like that. I'm perfectly happy to concede that there is a tendency in human psychology that leads to what we call fascism, simply in the sense that fascism, like the way we view sort of things in the world in our immediate perception and in our conception even, it relies upon identifying a circle within which are the things that you care about, and that which are the things that are different from it, either are uninteresting or are threatening to it, and then you organize the world around you and the people around you to the extent that you can to follow that interest. But I think by the same token, like, I don't think that's intrinsically admirable for that reason. In fact, it might be kind of consistent with the same kind of thought process that leads a child to, like, be cruel to small animals, or things of that sort. And there might actually be something more noble in doing violence to that notion that seems so intuitive.
Yeah, so to agents, it doesn't consider part of the tribe. All right, so what I took away from what you just said is nature can be fascistic. And so if we're talking about, like, identifying the political corporatism, so basically, like, we're identifying a tribal group that we're going to be allied to, and then flexible authoritarianism, we are going to break or bend the rules as necessary in order to do what needs doing. I think under threat circumstances, this is oftentimes how we see beings in nature act. This is also what we see in emergency scenarios. You could consider, for instance, during World War II, the internment of the Japanese people in the United States of America, which was fighting for mixed economy capitalism and liberal democracy. You could view that as fascistic. We suspended the typical rules that we extend to other human beings, and we just said, we're in an existential scenario, let's go ahead and break the rules in order to fuck over this group of people. You can call that fascistic. One of the things that you mentioned was looking to nature for God's hand. I still do that because there is a whole bunch of cruelty and malice and evil in nature, but there also is, kindness and love and nurturing and all that kind of stuff as well. So you have to look for both simultaneously. And I actually view that as the way that humans should conduct themselves. They should both be capable of, like, great feats of virtue, but they should also be capable of great acts of violence in order to defend their own survival. I have 3 more points. I'll try to be brief. So this reminds me of a conversation I actually had with my dad. He's been reading a lot of Stoics, and he commented, I don't know what philosopher he was reading, but he said that the person or humanity are the gods that take shits. So we have this, like, really highfalutin, philosophical brain that's trying to ponder the heavens, but we're stuck on a material plane that demands of us some level of barbarism. I think the other way he phrased it is that our minds are trapped in heaven, but our feet are stuck in the mud. Sorry, last point. That was 2. Last one.
Okay.
The last one was
that 2?
That was 2 because the minds in heaven, feet in the mud, and God who shits and dies, those are 2. But anyways, childish cruelty towards animals who are not a part of your tribe. So I think that this is something that can be taught. So for instance, my child or my children, very similar to me, I think that I'm fairly temperamentally empathetic and kind as a default. I try to do that, but you have to see the thing that you're looking at as an agent of your tribe. So whether that's a dog or a cat or a lizard or a snake or a bird or something, you have to view it as, like, a positive extension of the world instead of a threat. Whereas as soon as you identify a threat, I think the default is to kill. So these things are instinctive, but I also think that they can be taught, and you shouldn't eliminate the violent impulse because there are justified uses of the violent impulse.
Well, justified by what, though? That's the question. If you're
oftentimes self-defense.
Well, sure, but I mean, the underlying question is not whether there are conditions under which you see it as reasonable for an agent in some circumstance to engage in some kind of violence. The question is whether or not you treat like an institution or an organ of institutionalized violence as like a magical unicorn that is responsible for securing all justice, truth, and security in a place. I think that's the key distinction here. It's not a matter of there being like pragmatic cases where you're perfectly willing and you find it perfectly understandable where somebody would use some piece of matter to break apart some other piece of matter. I think the question is whether or not you fetishize some particular... Yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to say, I think that I have a largely liberal or libertarian impulse, which is as much as you can do outside of the state, negotiated between peaceful parties, should be done.
Yeah.
And when we also look at like the advances in culture and history and technology, they're oftentimes achieved outside of the state. And they're facilitated by the state, but they're not achieved by the state. And so the state is more like an organ through which you can secure the conditions for human flourishing, not the vehicle through which great achievements are caused.
But by the same token, you still presume that the state is sort of omnipresent in all of these scenarios, regardless of whether or not the state as such, for example, is the agent through which, I don't know, security on the street is sort of attained, or like inequality is remedied, or maybe the after effects of inequality are remedied.
Well, but I believe in a social optimization of the things outside of the state. So, for instance, you brought up how urban planning could be used to deter or prevent or eliminate crime. I think that's possible to a 99th degree. I think you could literally design a city so well that you actually reduce like crimes of violence and rape and drug trafficking and drug consumption and deaths of despair. I think you could literally design a city in order to reduce all of those to a maximal degree. But there will still be edge cases that need to be done.
That 1% or that 0.1%, I can't remember if it was 99 or 99.99. Sure, but even so, like, I doubt, for example, that you would agree that that's possible in the absence of a state entirely, because you probably root the state as the condition of there being cities and other institutions and things like that altogether. You probably think of them as being the necessary requirement for securing the kind of stability and long-term planning and social cohesion that allows for these things to even exist or function.
I do, and I'm sorry, Tyler, do you have anything to say? Because otherwise I'm going to go on another 2-minute rant.
I don't know. I don't know if I should let you go on the 2-minute rant or if I should throw my wrench. I guess
I'll write down a note. You throw in your 2 cents. I'll write my note down, actually.
All right. There's I think there's an issue that when we're talking about this stuff is that we're always presupposing the existence of a state before we achieve fascist thought, which I think is probably the biggest error, because if we're presuming the existence of a state, that means that the non-existence of the state could eliminate fascism. And I think articulating it not as a state, which is an organizational construction that must by default be this thing, instead saying something more along the lines of organizational authority would probably be better, because fascism can quite literally, thanks to the existence of fascists, exist outside of access to state power. And as a matter of fact, very often fascists are doing fascism and they are indiscernible from what they would be doing at the highest auspices. There is no true difference between them when they don't have access to a state's authority versus when they do have access to a state authority.
So responding,
they still
to both,
do extra.
Sorry, yeah, responding to both of you, because this actually gets back to the Brianna Wu memes. So you identified that the fascistic impulse is experiencing a threat and then being willing to throw like authority towards some kind of structure, and then being willing to like suspend the rules temporarily in order to achieve the result. I think this is fundamentally true. And if you look at like war scenarios or whatever in which people took on like authoritarian measures that we would deem fascistic, this is the repeated emotional and sociological pattern that we see over and over and over again. Now, the thing about that is
I just want to clarify mine. I put it a little bit more different. I think the fascistic impulse, if you wanted to say it, just to, so because if it's mine that we're putting out, would be the kind of bone deep personal need of any individual to collectivize in order to identify an us them structure that can only be settled through violence. Would be my
here's the thing. I don't like in there. I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I'm presuming that you view that as bad, quote unquote.
No.
However, I don't
moralize about it.
Okay, so we might be in agreement here. I think that the ability for human beings,
Sunday aren't necessarily like at odds or anything, but there's differences. So if you've been talking to Sunday, I have to do the entire Sunday speech to try to get you to my stupid little my little subtleties that are different.
No, it's okay. So addressing you and then addressing Sunday's point. So if you don't moralize about it, that's good. I don't either, because I think the us them mentality is actually always going to have like it's always going to potentially exist. So for instance, if we achieve an optimized minimal state, minimal violence society on planet Earth, but then all of a sudden, like, you know, aliens from a different solar system show up and they just start massacring everybody, we're going to have to rely on that impulse to even have a chance at survival. And also, if we consider
you're
space
describing the plot
colonization,
of Starship Troopers.
I am. So, and then also, if we're going to do space colonization, the plot of Aliens, then we're likewise going to need to be able to tribalize, collect authority, do violence towards an existential threat, and then come up with rules that we think will stabilize our societies in the long term. And so, Sunday, you made a point to me that I want to respond to, which is the I believe that a state is necessary for creating this optimized society. And I think that's true. And the reason why is, let's say that we just cede authority completely to the people and we actually run a series of social experiments in order to optimize society. Well, eventually we're going to come to results, but people are going to be invested in their projects, and their projects might have, I don't know, negative externalities or consequences or whatever. And so it will take the authority of the state to say, actually, your design kind of sucks and it's killing people. This is the standard to which we want everybody to adhere. Here are the justifications why. Now, if you don't adhere to it within the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to send cops to beat you up to make you adhere to our model.
Okay. But here's a question for you. You've identified the necessity of the state with its ability to enforce compliance with some kind of ordinance. And we're just speaking generally, under the presumption that other institutions can't enforce compliance. Why is it able to do this? What are the things that feed into the state's ability to enforce compliance? For example, you send cops with non-military grade weapons to enforce a law. Well, they show up. Maybe the cops aren't respected and maybe they're outnumbered. This has happened in several different places. Do they cease being, does the state therefore like cease being the state, or do they now suddenly become the state in that look? Or like what specifically happens under those circumstances?
Yeah, I know you're a fan of Game of Thrones, and I know you're a fan of Game of Thrones parables. So I would go for the a rich man, a priest, and a king, and a man with a sword are all standing in a room.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, each one of them say to the man with the sword, hey, kill the other two, and I'll, you know, the priest says, I'll grant you an afterlife. The king says, I'll give you a fiefdom and lands and wenches and all that kind of stuff. And the rich man says, I'll make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. And so, you know, I think it's Tyrion, and I think it's Varys. And so Varys asks him, like, who does the swordsman, you know, choose to follow? And the truth is that there's no answer to the parable. Power resides where people believe it resides. And so it could reside with the sword. It could reside with the church. It could reside with the king. It could reside with the rich man. It's where people believe power is. And so this is part of the reason why I think I'm a Republican and I believe in a republic, is because I think that laws should be negotiated. I think they should be negotiated by our most intelligent people. I think that we should vest the republic with a certain level of authority, and that its stewards have to respect the rule of law brought about by that republic, or else it becomes void and bankrupt and the people can smash it. And we've seen that throughout history when corrupt institutions no longer serve the people's needs, them being brought down.
Okay, but you kind of identified. Let's sort of run with that parable for a little bit. So supposedly there's no answer. Okay. What does the man with the sword represent in this case for your argument?
Violence.
Just violence by itself. Not identify.
Well, I mean, you can articulate more, but I think he represents violence.
Well, I presumably, like, it's a capacity for violence. He's got a sword, but like we've identified a priest, so one institution. We've identified, I forget the other two, but I'm going to presume like
the authority of God, the authority of money, and the authority of the king.
Yeah, so different like institutions or whatever. Which one of these is the state?
I would say the king.
You say the king.
Yeah.
What distinguishes the king from the economic or from the religious?
What's funny is that there largely isn't, because people can presume that money is the primary virtue. As a matter of fact, I think people that you and I are critical of are people who only care about money as virtue. I think that also people can believe that religion is the only virtue that matters. I think that Christian nationalists in the United States of America are demonstrating that now. So again, we're not relying. If your point is that it doesn't necessarily rest in the state, I agree, because I think that where power resides is the capacity for violence.
Well, that's the thing, though, is if the power for violence, if the thing by which compliance is enforced is not specific to the state itself, or is not specific to some specific governmental body or whatever you like, but can be vested in either like the priest or the king or the banker or the people or whatever you like, then it still begs the question, why is the state itself a necessary component in your understanding for enforcing compliance? Because it seems like enforcement, and I would disagree with the notion that enforcement can only be done at the end of a sword. In fact, I think actually enforcement is a lot stronger when it doesn't require that at all. But let's run with that for a second. Given the fact that this thing can seem to be wielded by any of these institutions, why the state in particular? Why is that specifically required to enforce compliance in all cases?
So when I'm thinking about these models, we're dividing them up into four, and I actually wouldn't mind taking the capacity for violence and also giving the swordsman, if you want to call him, or the peasant with a sword, also giving him the role of the population, right? Like the sword represents violence and power, but he is the population, because the population is ultimately who is deciding where power is distributed. So when it comes to the church, as an example, the church can offer in afterlife, moral codification, spiritual guidance, all that kind of stuff, right? The merchant can offer material wealth, but with both of these are drawbacks. The church can obviously abuse its authority through God, and not only that, it can make the material plane physically miserable. The wealthy man, the merchant, the money, the worship of material things, that can make you incredibly rich. But if you neglect your morality or your social cohesion, you can create an absolutely miserable society. And then the swordsman too, that might be the population and the example of the capacity for violence, but they might not have the wisdom to wield power and violence in a way that's good, and they might not be able to agree with it. It's actually the king or the state, as in my view, a republic is probably the best one, that comes up with a code of secular behavior that governs all the other institutions to be optimized. And so that is the imperfect role of the state.
Why do you think so?
Why do I think so? Because, I mean, when I look at the United States American Constitution, when I look at the monarchy, when I look at the constitutional monarchies of Europe, that's all of their claim to authority.
But if their authority is downstream from other institutions securing, for example, the kinds of security and social cohesion that make that kind of administration even possible in the first place, then doesn't that leave open the possibility of the state itself being either superfluous or just another institution among equals, and maybe not necessarily one that's actually responsible for securing that at all, since it appears to require the others to do that work for it?
This is something that I was thinking was wildly interesting before we even had this conversation, because you talk about methodological anarchism, and you also are appealing to me about like, well, why are we giving these people any more authority than anybody else? The reason why I would say that you would give these people authorities is because if you look at the economies and social situations of history, these institutions didn't crop up out of the ether. They came up because there was a demand and need of the time, whether that was like physical security. I mean, physical security was actually the main one. So physical security was like the main thing that drove kings and dukes and fiefdoms and kingdoms and all that kind of shit. And what's also true is you, President Sunday, spend a large amount of time viewing the average person on Twitch and YouTube politics and basically calling them retarded morons who barely deserve to breathe, let alone wield power. So how are
spicy,
you
baby?
No, so how are you?
No, I wonder at how they manage to breathe. I don't believe any human being doesn't deserve to breathe.
Call this man a slur.
Nah, I'll be polite.
You just woke me back up. You woke me back up.
People, I do not care about ableism, but I will be polite to the people in President Sunday's chat who do care about ableism. So no,
You already said it's too late now. It's. But
I didn't say anything too mean. I think I said stupid.
Oh, you were paraphrasing me. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So how come you're appealing to me like we don't need this organ of civilization because power is where we believe it to be, or we can do it without this organ?
Well, you've asserted that kings and dukes were sort of driven by this need for security, but I can't help but notice that you sort of presumed the existence of kings and dukes in the first place. And is it not conceivable that since we're not operating in a state of nature, there is some much earlier begun activity, intellectual and practical in human history, that has made that imperative to defend oneself against these other sort of equivalent militarized bodies of people that therefore also lay claim to ultimate administrative and judicial authority and things like that. Is it not possible that maybe the question actually should be interrogating how we conceive of human organization at a deeper level? And it's not just a matter of, well, there are other states, obviously, so we need a state as a weapon of war, essentially, in order to bat them all off and keep them at bay. What if the anarchist position is actually targeting something a little bit more fundamental? And it's not necessarily a naive notion that, well, what we can do is just wipe the slate clean and just build entirely new institutions with non-hierarchical governmental systems that just so happen to do all of the exact same things that these do. Maybe what's kind of being poked at is there are some underlying assumptions in our logic about how we think about these things that make it so that even at the point where they're obsolete, like even if just carrying the logic forward further and further, as you have economies more and more intertwined, as you have like sovereign power more and more localized and not even necessarily localized in particular states, but even abstracted away to like corporations or to particular like flows of capital or whatever. Maybe it's still making that state-centric mode, that sort of fascizing tendency, seem kind of necessarily intuitive, and kind of making it so it's very, very difficult to break out of that line of thinking, even when it's actually not logically necessary. And the point isn't. Yeah. Go on, please.
I can answer this one. Put me in, coach. I've been on the sidelines for too long. I'm at the 50, baby. I'm at the 50.
I might have to time out and hit the head in a second anyways, but I want to hear what you have to say because I have my own rebuttal.
Oh, it's so good. I think there's an issue here that's kind of popping up between you guys. It's kind of like it's interesting that I'm sitting right here because we have basically like a solutionist and a dissolutionist sort of mentality toward state building or organization. Where, is the ultimate point of the organization to eliminate the need for the organization? Are we going Cincinnatus with it? Or is the ultimate point of the organization to protect the internals of the organization, which is, it is what it is. But I think some of the gaming about this kind of always presupposes a singularity of state, as in, there are independent bodies which are singular in their authority and are controlling from the top down, which is just not really the case. The biggest organizations, the smallest organizations, very often are really just collections of similar organizations through which there's some level of granted authority or concession going up and down and up and down and up and down. And one of the most notorious and obvious things about any body is that if a body is established for the protection of the units within the body, the dissolution of the body is of utmost terror to the body itself. And so an almost perfect situation must not only be provided, but must be in place to move toward the dissolution of the body. If we're going to sit down and, for all the issues of America, say like, no more America tomorrow, you have to have a really good fucking setup. And so even just arguing in that direction presents such a logical hurdle for the average person to get over, and kind of a emotional hurdle that it can be a little bit kind of crazy. Well, but also on the other side, once you start trying to speak toward dissolution, you do kind of calcify solutionists, so to say. I guess you would. I'm making up terms here, and I'm sorry, but hopefully I'm just keeping everybody along the line.
No, I'm tracking.
And so we get to a point where we're also saying, well, we have to have this state, and so we end up gaming through. And I've kind of listened to you guys. We game into existence this sort of like state, which is representative of approximately nowhere on Earth, made up of Game of Thrones references and allusions to America and this, that, and the other, that really cannot fit with a materialist assessment of what can and can't happen based on historical fact. And it's like very fascinating. I don't have a fix for it.
I disagree.
This is just the issue. This is the issue in the conversation, or the
Sunday. I want to give you some fodder before you respond to either one of us. No, because I'll try to address you as well. So if we're talking about like this ethereal, I think I heard Socrates earlier, like is Socrates plane of form, Socrates plane of state, right? Like, sure. Why do we have this like perfect idea of a state, and why must it always exist, especially when we see that the functions can exist outside the institutions? So are both of y'all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Maslow's hierarchy.
Sorry, continue.
Okay. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think is really interesting, and I think is one of the lenses that I am no longer capable of analyzing the world without Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what I mean by that is it's a social theory that's obviously imperfect, but it basically says that there's tiers of human behavior: physiological, security, social, ego, self-actualization. And, people can
continue on?
Sure.
I'm so sorry, but Marine to Marine, did you first learn of it from the same fucking
Noble Leadership?
Yes.
I took a class called Noble Leadership. Yeah, and it was a binder, and it had Maslow's hierarchy of needs in it.
There's no judgment. I know that's where I learned about it too the first time. The first time, but I learned more later. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, the theory goes that it is possible but very difficult to focus on higher tiers of need if your lower tiers are threatened. So for instance, if you're in a war-torn nation and your physical security would typically be a super high priority, if you can't find food, if you can't find water, if you can't find shelter, you will risk your physical security by running in front of guns in order to secure food, water, and shelter, because those are necessary for you to survive. Same thing with the social tier. Human beings are social animals. They require interaction. It's going to be very difficult for you to socialize with your friends and have a good time and smoke cigarettes and enjoy your family life if your physical security or your physiological needs are being threatened. Finally, ego is just like work, ambitions, all the things that we pursue. It's going to be very difficult to focus on work and ambitions if your social security and physiological needs are being neglected. Finally, self-actualization is just becoming the best human being you can be. And the truth is, you can only do that under optimal conditions. The reason why I bring this up is because the security tier and also the physiological tier, to be honest, is so fundamentally important to human life that I think that whenever you leave it up to the private sector, it's so rife for like abuse and mismanagement and like unnecessary death, destruction, and evil that you basically presuppose an authority stepping in and trying to adjudicate any dispute at those tiers. And then the social ego and self-actualization tiers, especially in a liberal society, we've largely left that up to the individual, which I think is good. I have more, but I'll leave it there.
Well, you've essentially made, by way of Maslow, you've essentially made the argument of Hobbes, which is the function of the state is to secure those basic securities, which we find intolerable to be in the absence of. But then I wonder, are you familiar at all with the early writings of Rousseau by chance?
No, but
the gay liberal.
Sorry. I was about to say I'll ask a question that might point to my distaste for why I wouldn't have read them. Did Rousseau write about the noble savage?
No. This is a common misconception, however, but I can understand why you think so. Rousseau's argument contra Hobbes.
Everybody watch my debate, and we're all talking about it. So I just say, you guys can compliment me.
Rousseau or the noble savage?
No, I talked to some Bulgarian Nazi like fucking 3 days ago or something, and he was going on about Rousseau and the noble savage. And I'm stupid, so I thought he was talking about Thoreau and Walden Pond because it rhymes and I have brain damage. That's pretty much it.
So
continue.
Hobbes,
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't forgive you. So
hey.
So Hobbes argues that the state is necessary and in fact is consented to, because in a state of nature we find the insecurity and the danger and the inability to secure the things of our desire as a consequence of that danger intolerable. And so insofar as we need to escape the state of nature in order to have any sort of peace of mind or to be like remotely happy to fulfill our desires, in other words, the state is obviously necessary. And then insofar as we continue to enjoy the benefits of that state, we carry on the initial consent to that organization in the state of nature. But Rousseau points out something kind of interesting in that when Hobbes talks about the need for security, let's just talk about security for a second. The security of what? You mentioned shelter. Shelter's an interesting thing. It's kind of like skin. It's the division between the inside and the outside. It's the hospitable, habitable place as opposed to the non-hospitable, non-habitable place. And you need this in order to be comfortable. But I do wonder, Connor, you've got a nice spacious room there. I was watching Godzilla -1 last night, and it was showing like some of these like dwellings in post Hiroshima, and they're like living out of like tiny little shacks about the size of this office space here, like multiple people. But they're living in there and they have friends and they have jobs, they do things. The space that you are using right now, the technology that makes that space livable, the products that you rely on for your level of comfort, that in fact sort of set up the bedrock of your comfort. These aren't things that are natural to you in a state of nature. These aren't the natural conditions of your flourishing. You exist and were raised in a situation that made you acclimated to these things that required a great distance using tremendous amounts of technology and manpower and often military force to expropriate land and resources and things like that in order to secure the flows of those things to you. If you're going to argue that the state sort of as the securer of the bedrock conditions of human life as necessary on those grounds, well, it sort of begs the question a little bit. If human beings obviously survived long in advance of there being a modern state to old age, doing like, and not just like doing nothing, like flourishing even, doing philosophy, becoming like excellent athletes, building like wonders and things like that. Even if you think there is some like earlier form of like sort of like state or whatever, like things that you don't like now, but we're talking about like the modern state presently. The point is, when you're talking about a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're sort of presuming that the things that satisfy those conditions, or rather the things that bar access to higher levels, are themselves historically omnipresent, or are just sort of like essential to the human condition. But I do wonder how much of the things populating this hierarchy of needs, things that we would associate with like filling this tier and this tier and this tier, how often are those things that human beings actually need, and how often are those things that human beings are made in a condition of statehood to need? Which is different from arguing like, oh well, we should obviously be in a situation where we don't have access to these things. But
yeah, I have a fairly passionate rebuttal, but I see Tyler dropping his chin. So if you want to respond first, that's fine.
I think there's there's a small hiccup. The comfort is very high on the hierarchy. Shelter isn't like my house is obviously a shelter, but shelter literally is in that context. It's there's fireballs coming out of the sky, and you're gonna go stand in a cave. Kind of thing. That's what shelter means. Just immediate.
Okay, but hang on a sec though. Hang on a sec. No. But that Tyler,
kind of shelter just means immediate protection from the environment.
But Tyler, you would not say that a patient, for example, of a therapist satisfies the bottom tier of the hierarchy of needs, provided they have a doorway to hide under a perpetual earthquake. They require shelter up to a certain standard, something that
which
doesn't,
is largely physical well-being, physical security. So what I would say in rebuttal is that if we were to analyze like human well-being and we were to come up with metrics that actually analyze human being like well-being, like having fulfilling social relationships, living into long age, having the proper nutrition, working at optimal physical health, being able to work out consistently, et cetera, we could come up with a series of tiers of human well-being. And I think that if you look at a man in a quote unquote state of nature, where he is kind of stuck at the bottom two tiers of trying to provide these things for himself, oftentimes we're gonna find that he is unable to do that. And oftentimes, like if you're looking at prehistorical tribal societies that are literally living off of the land, consuming vegetation and hunting for life, they might have better cardiovascular systems than us, but they still die of like diarrhea and fucking smallpox and the common flu and all that kind of shit fucking randomly.
Sure.
Like the amount of like death and deprivation that is found within a state of nature is actually quite shocking. And even if you look at as recent, we consider civilization this like 3,000-year-old project. But even if you look 150 years ago, the material conditions that people were living under were fucking horrifying to the modern mind. I think it was like what was it, like a third or 20% or 15% of like kids like died under the age of 10 or some shit like that. The numbers are fucking crazy. So
I mean, certainly, but just to like sort of preempt you a little bit, the technologies that allowed us to extract so many people from that condition, often at the expense of other people, by the way, but leaving that aside, and leaving aside, of course, like the extreme case of that, which is...
You don't have to leave it aside. I would say we also have a duty to get those people away from that condition, but I'm sorry for interrupting.
Oh, no, well, I wasn't necessarily implying that you were going to contradict that, but I think the point I'm getting at here is it doesn't appear, given that we've had 3,000 years, the variable element doesn't appear to be the presence of an absolute sovereign in a territory. The variable element appears to be certain cultural shifts that cause changes in, change norms about how we like interrogate the world, interrogate our social institutions, and things of that sort. And in, I think, virtually every single case, whether or not it played a part of the contingent set of situations that gave rise to the eventual progress that we achieved, the state or the pre-state, or whatever you want to call it as such, has often been actually a direct impediment to that, because those changes necessarily threaten an order in which it has found hospitable ground.
Yeah. So the state has been an impediment, not an assistance. Okay, so I want to say one more thing about the state of nature, and then I want to address what you just said.
Go for it.
So for the state of nature, if people romanticize the state of nature, I invite them to explore it. I think that Tyler and I, both as former Marines, can attest to the fact that interacting with a more tribalistic, communal, food deprived, sleep deprived, nature oriented state of nature is actually quite the pain in the ass. If you want to carry 200-pound packs on your back for 10 miles a fucking day, be my fucking guest. If you want to live in swamps and fucking, hunt and all that kind of shit, be my guest. If you want to return to nature, be my fucking guest. But my guess is that 95% of you will return to this boring, mundane, concrete civilization within a matter of days, if not weeks, if not months. So I just wanted to say that if people are romanticizing the state of nature.
Well, that's what Rousseau said, by the way. Like Rousseau said this of himself.
What is that? Most people will.
No, he was asked, like, why don't you
civilization?
Why don't you just, if you think the state of nature is, because he's been misrepresented even since he was alive. If you think the state of nature is so wonderful, then why don't you go back to it? He said, well, I love civilization too much. I require writing and all these things in order to be comfortable. The point that Rousseau is making, and that other thinkers after him are making, is not that the state of nature is so lovely. The point that people like that are making is that there is no state of nature. As soon as we're talking about any kind of social situation, we're not talking about a situation that is downstream from raw, unintelligently interfered with a world you're always dealing with a world that is constructed between individuals that has an artifice to it. And you're dealing with that even prior to the point at which human beings, as we understand them today, even emerges as unique organisms.
I agree with your last statement. If I can add to it, almost. So, I think that we, in our silly little air-conditioned houses with our silly little microphones, with our silly little computers, are still operating in a state of nature. I think that nature is immediately.
So again, I couldn't hear that, Tyler.
He said his microphone is not silly. He invested in his microphone.
Mine's very nice.
Yeah,
so I can't tell how good.
I have a nice microphone as well. So the point being that the same way that I view birds building nests or beavers building dams or, shrikes using thorns in order to impale their prey so they can eat them, I view the human ability to think and build social constructs that are complex and also build complex habitats or whatever. I view this as our nature. Now, that being said, we're out of a level of I forget if you call it like homeostasis or whatever, but we're out of flux with the environment to the point that we're kind of destroying nature in a way. But I would also view the fact that our population and our replacement rate is precipitously dropping is likely a subconscious natural calibration, because we know subconsciously that we are destroying the planet in order to live the life that we live, and we know that it's not sustainable. So
I mean, I'm not reproducing right now because it's fucking expensive to pay for a kid, among other things.
Well, I think that's a function of the economy, which is a reflection of natural, it's the reflection of the materials that you can procure in order to generate offspring.
Okay, but that's a thesis that we are sort of subconsciously cognizing that, oh, no, guys, we need to slow down. The world can't sustain our numbers, I'm not going to push back on that so much because I enjoy it.
It might not be true.
I would never push back on it because I want less of y'all.
That's okay, true.
That's
so anyways, getting to Sunday's point then. So getting to Sunday's point though, sorry, you were talking shit about Ireland. What's going on?
Yeah. If I talk for like 5 seconds about something else, I guarantee we're so off topic right now. We'll just go to something else. Can I just be honest? I stopped paying attention a little bit, and I'm fucking completely confused because I've never read Rousseau, and I don't know which one of you are correct about the state of nature, because I have never looked that definition up.
It's me.
I'm just here floating. I'm happily underneath, but I haven't talked in a long time, and I'm exploding like a steam kettle. Don't worry, this is just me blowing out.
It's me because even Hobbes is pointing out that what he's actually doing, despite the fact that he thought he could look at natives in America as examples of people living in a state of nature, what he was actually doing was trying to read the necessary logical course that human beings as they are now must have taken to get here, but he's presuming that they are as they are now to get here, which is the essence of Rousseau's critique. It's like you're taking modern man, which has things like amour propre, this love of self as conceived as this reputational entity that exists in a society and things like that. So if you, for example, would be willing to go to war with other people for honor or out of jealousy or things like that, that's a thing that requires certain conditions that are not in a state of nature. Defense of property, defense of certain kinds of goods. All of these things require a particular history of human action under very specific conditions to even be present. So they cannot obviously pre-exist in the human psyche in a state of nature to justify the institution that later on secures those things thousands of years in the future.
Which again, this is another thing.
So he never saw animals. They do that shit, right?
What's up?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
They've got social status, right? And they fucking kill each other.
Animals beef. I guess animals have reputational shit. They're tribalistic. They fight in social groups.
Well, be careful.
They have wars.
Be careful there, though.
I understand the point he's trying to make.
No, but you got to be a little bit. You got to be a little bit careful though, because the argument here is not, for example, that human beings are unique in engaging in collective action that involves, for example, pecking orders, or in securing or in excluding, let's say, other groups of organisms from specific zones. That obviously goes back to the beginning of life almost. The point is, when you're talking about a state of nature motivating the existence of an institution, you're not talking about the fact that life has a tendency to cordon off an outside from an inside. We all have skin, obviously. At even the subcellular level, there's an understanding of the need to section off space and defend it. The point is that
permeable and non-permeable surfaces,
the point is that if you're trying to argue for the existence of an institution that secures that at a particular level of abstraction, it's not enough to simply say monkey need to defend tree, therefore big monkey made of many monkey. You see what I'm saying?
Well, hold on.
No.
See.
Yeah, I know, I get it, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is
exact argument.
But it's not.
No, I'm serious. You go first, but I want to go back to my monkey argument.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I will always get back there. I feel like, Connor. My point is that other species just do have self-awareness and awareness of their self relative to the group in a non-resource level way. Like they understand that there are social expectations for them as their own animal within the animal or within the little sub society that they exist in. It might not be as complex as us, where you have 10 million variables on the average human being to justify how they exist, but grooming standards, ability to dance, even though the dance is something that a bird or this or that sort of animal will know how to do, it needs to know how to do it, and if it can't do it right, it will be kicked out. There's birds that decorate themselves literally, and it's not like you have to be an absolute, like in a weird way, so human centric that you have to ignore the possibility that any other thing can emulate the same sort of actions that we do and derive them.
I disagree, and actually I'm gonna actually counter and flip that on you. I think, in fact,
okay,
with all due respect, you're being much more human centric than I am in this respect. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Almost impossible.
It's actually not, and I'll explain why.
Go on.
Yeah, just as by way of analogy, or actually, it's an example of the same phenomena. Are you familiar with Baudrillard's book, "The Gulf War Didn't Take Place"? I think that's what it's called. The book "Gulf War Didn't Happen."
The Gulf War didn't happen.
The Gulf War. There never was a Gulf War. Let me see. Let me just get the title right, so people aren't just chewing me out.
No,
I'm unfamiliar.
It's fine. It's fine.
No, but it's important. The Gulf War did not. It is the Gulf War did not take place. Okay. Baudrillard's not an idiot. He's obviously not going to say there weren't factions of people fighting with guns and with missiles and things like that in the Gulf. The reason why the Gulf War didn't take place is because at no point in human history did this ineffable essence cover over time and space, so that in this region at this time, there was this mystical state of war that was different from other states. There wasn't a thing overlaying it. Similarly, the bare fact that we can, as an afterimage of our own experience, overlay things like community, war, tribalism, defense, borders, etc., over the activities of like bonobos or whatever, does not mean that that is what they are doing. And the reason why I say that you're actually being more human-centric is because you are privileging what are actually species-distinct concepts, not even species-distinct, often historically and culturally distinct concepts and principles over the activities and psychologies even of radically different organisms from us, under the assumption that they couldn't be something else, or that if they are anything, this is the height to which they can attain. It's distinctly possible that other animals have radically different, almost unintelligible views of these things that aren't beneath ours. They just operate differently. And to assume that, for example, like other primates engage in war or have like the exact same institutions we do, just at a different level or more primitive or something, is actually the height of anthropocentrism. You're specifically taking things that are intuitive to human psychology and saying that this must be, to be fair, what these things must be capable of. And no one's saying like, well, metaphysically they're not capable of doing so. It's like, well, maybe that doesn't exhaust the full range of possibilities, and by insisting that this is war, we're actually kind of insisting that this thing that we do right now, this is a fixture in the universe. This is a thing to which other animals gravitate, and I think that's extremely presumptuous.
I'm extremely presumptuous.
Misunderstanding what I'm talking about. Describing something with the limited terms that you don't understand, with the limited terms that you do, does not infer automatically that you have arrived at a final distinction for the thing that you're observing. You're just literally describing it in the best terms that you can as a distinct phenomena from the commonality that you have perceived. But the ultimate point really is that there are things that just perceive themselves, right? And so the state of nature of mankind is literally us. There is no version of mankind that is inseparable, or that is separable from its self-awareness and sapience. We literally are as we are because we are, in an absurd way. My ability to perceive myself relative to society and exist in it is an aspect of literally the species I am. It's indiscernible from me. To the same way that,
what objectivism are you appealing to?
Being very bonobo-centric when you're trying to say that that they're engaging in our sort of grooming thing.
Yeah, you're human, so you understand with the human bias. So what objectivism are you appealing to?
But hang on, slow down, cowboy, because when you're talking about your natural human condition, like the set of things that are essential to the human, you're talking about a thing that is the product of a long series of transformations that are themselves the product of historical contingencies. Why would you presume that there even is such a thing at the level of the inside of your head of an essential set of experiences and activities and things like that? Why couldn't these equally be conditioned by your environment, even the environment of the womb at a chemical level?
They are.
What?
Yeah.
I lost track of that one.
Well, hold on. So if I can, I'm just, President Sunday laid out a bear trap, and I'm just going to jam my leg into it. Okay. So I am a human supremacist, and I am projecting my psychology onto other species. Now, this might be arrogant, but at the same time, you can inject nuance and understanding of these categories of like social hierarchy, or like I would consider honor to be a sort of human nuanced pecking order, where you're appealing to these, broader, higher idealistic behaviors, and you're doing so likely, maybe there's a subconscious part of you that's doing it because like it's just quote unquote the right thing to do, and you're appealing to God or virtue or metaphysical law or some shit, but likely it's to prove to your peers that you are worthy of respect, and more importantly, proving to females that you are worthy of reproducing with. And so this in and of itself is like a social behavior that you can project all the way back down onto fucking like lobsters and crabs and shit, where certain behaviors are going to optimize reproduction and health and survival. So I do appeal to that. And then one of the things that you said in jest, but I'm going to jump on the bear trap. You said, because monkeys have social status, we are presuming that as slightly advanced monkeys, we create social institutions necessarily in order to rule more monkeys and make them behave a certain way. I believe that fully. I think that when you're talking about social behaviors and you're talking about like primitive, different creatures, or just different creatures who aren't primitive, yeah, absolutely. We are creating these social abstractions in order to facilitate our survival as a species. That's what we're always aiming towards.
No. I was just saying that you shouldn't say that monkeys are going to war, even if you just consider, like, just as one example.
But if we understand it as like a territorial dispute,
be hyper pedantic. I didn't say that.
But that's not. Hang on. That's
not even a point relative to the point that I made. I don't know who that. At this point, that's like
if they're going into tribal conflict. But hold on, let me bite the bullet. If they're going into tribal conflict and inflicting casualties on each other that then affect who controls the territory, that's effectively war.
Well, first of all, it's not. But secondly, you're presuming tribalism as well in that, and tribalism is not the bare fact of like organisms or like individuals operating in tandem in conflict.
Well, hold on. I gotta. What is war then? What is
well,
war?
I was about to get into that. So, for example, there's a whole literature on the philosophy of war in which it is actually, we distinguish really strongly between war and other types of conflict. For example, we don't consider murder to be applicable in war, and there are reasons for this. Among other things, the agency of the individual in a state of war is typically considered...
That's not true.
Beg your pardon?
You can murder people during war.
You can murder people during war, but killing people on the battlefield is not considered murder intrinsically. Yet if I were, for example, to murder you... Sure.
No, sorry. I want to hear.
Shit, but technically, that's not necessarily true.
Well, I want to hear your expanded definition.
Murder people.
I want to hear your expanded definition.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, for example, like a gang from some tribe, if you will, like a gang of Canadians, and going onto American territory and murdering a bunch of people and even taking over their house, that wouldn't be an act of war. That would be a crime, right? When we're talking about war, when we're talking about war, we're invoking something that is downstream from the will of the collectivity understood in the abstract.
Well, but we're talking about
hold on. So this is about war. It's a Canadians going to places in Canada, a gang of people in Canada going inside Canada to another place and taking over a house.
Yeah.
Run that hypothetical by me again.
Well, hold on. I want to answer his hypothetical because I think you'll understand it when I'm saying it. So the difference between like a gang of Canadians going into an American territory, murdering people and taking over their property or whatever, is oftentimes we conceptualize war as pure tribal factions engaged in some level of like symmetric conflict.
Well, clearly not. Israel's been at war with Hamas, for example. They clearly aren't peers.
Yeah, but they both have guns and rockets.
Well, I mean, but I mean, the Hell's Angels have guns. They can't wage war on the United States.
But they can't wage war on the United States, but they can wage war at their level with other gangs, and they call it a gang war.
We also have the term asymmetric warfare. And by the way, you might be able to observe some form. This is a really you might be able to observe. Hold on, you might be able to observe asymmetric warfare in nature. So, for instance, let's say that bonobos, I don't know if they're smaller than chimpanzees. I don't really track like monkey shit, right? But let's just say that gorillas and chimps, let's say that they're fighting over territory. The gorillas are stronger. The chimps have less strength, but they're smarter, and they're both fighting for access to a watering hole or something like that. The chimps might literally go in a small group through gorilla territory in order to gain access to the water stuff. And then if a gorilla confronts them, they'll kick that gorilla's ass and then they'll run because they know the rest of the pack is coming. Okay, that is effectively asymmetric warfare.
If on October 7th, Hamas didn't make an incursion into Israeli territory, but a person who was in Hamas and some of his friends did, that wouldn't be an act of war by Hamas, even if the activities they engaged in were identical. When we talk about war, we're talking about an act of violence by a collectivity understood in the abstract as a unit. There's no reason to think that a family group of primates, for example, conceptualizes themselves in that way, or conceptualizes themselves as engaging in that kind of violence against another such abstract group. Because that's another additional factor to this. We don't talk about war properly speaking when we're like, for example, Germany didn't wage war on the Jews; they just exterminated them, right?
But I would want to talk to.
This is pedantry.
But this isn't pedantry. This is actually really important.
Pedantry. Okay, listen. I will concede that I am being overly simplistic with my projection of human social phenomena onto animals. However, I am just saying instinctively that I think if I was to talk to a primatologist or somebody who studied wolves or somebody who studied bears or somebody who studied like social animals, that they would probably identify, like, it might not be an abstraction within the wolf's mind, but a wolf can probably still tell who is a member of his pack and who isn't, and then make choices of violence or non-violence based off of that. They can also make choices of let's say that they're running in a smaller group because they got temporarily separated. They can make a choice of whether or not to attack another group that appears to be larger. These are the choices that are made in conflict that are similar to war, if not the same.
I mean, the state of philosophy of mind right now is that we are not even in coherent agreement as to whether or not consciousness as a thing is coherent, or whether or not perception in that simple sense of there is an image floating before a computer that somehow magically comprehends that image, that's actually how cognition takes place. To assume that we understand in the abstract, like the organizing principles in the minds of animals, I think is a tremendous leap. Leaving aside the fact that we're...
But aren't you getting so anti-realist that you're no longer interacting with reality? That's like my problem here.
But I'm describing the condition of reality. Here, I'm going to explain why this isn't... I'm going to explain why this isn't pedantic. The reason why we're talking about what animals do is because we're trying to find the primitive reflection, the prior reflection of current institutions in the behaviors of creatures that we can conceptualize as being like our ancestors. The problem is that if you're actually overlaying the behavior of those things with what seems intuitive to us based on how we would imagine ourselves in the first person doing those things, and you're ignoring the fact that we only conceive of these things using these categories because of the way in which we've been conditioned to operate in this environment, then you're actually not talking about what animals do at all. You're imagining that animals are doing something like what we're doing, but with the methods that are available to them. And I think that's a deep mistake.
Can I tell you the presumption
but why?
that I'm
because
making,
we do
though?
that. Hold on. Where is that line drawn? Because if I see a fucking animal reach down and pick up and eat something, and it's observable,
Yeah,
that
you're
ate
like, he's
something,
hungry.
but I can't. I don't go. Hold on now, everybody. We've never seen inside the mind of a chimp. He could be doing anything right now. At what point, when I rise up, does things that are observable that they're doing, like if a chimp sees another chimp with something he wants, and then he goes and beats that other chimp to death with a rock?
Sure.
Now, hold on, everybody, this isn't murder, because only a human being can commit murder. We don't know what's inside the mind of the chimp. He could be doing anything. Like,
no,
this
but
is what this sounds like to me.
a single cell.
Make any fucking sense.
No, but a unicellular organism will also eat another unicellular organism or will compete for food, right? That doesn't mean, though, that the activity that the two things are engaging in is identical at a cognitive level, which is important because we're talking about family groups.
You can't really compare the cognition of something that doesn't have a brain with something that does.
That's kind of my point.
Single cell animals don't have brains, so obviously there's no cognition.
But hang on, if we're talking about the historical evolutionary roots of institutions, and it appears as if an activity is consistent between a brainless organism and a non-brainless organism, and that's consistent, by the way, with the institution we're trying to explain.
We're talking about chimps which have brains. Why are we talking about parameciums?
Because
we don't need to go back 4 billion years to discover the heart of war.
Because the assertion was that tribes of animals go to war, and that's a mistake. Because going to war
implies human presumption.
Well, going to war implies more than just the bare fact of an aggregate of animals doing damage to another aggregate of animals. For one, there is the conception of being part of an aggregate that itself does the thing, right? That's the difference between an institution and simply a behavior. An institution is something that is understood as an abstraction that does things by itself. The state is not an organism. The state is a collection of organisms that understand each other to be in a specific abstract relation, one of which allows them to go to war.
Well, Sunday, so
I
want to address this.
You just still arrive at the same thing. Like, they know that they're all part of the same family. They do.
Really?
They know.
I want to tell you the thread that unifies them, that I believe unifies them.
All right,
go ahead. Well, I was going to say, if I look at a paramecium or whatever, a single-celled organism consuming another organism, or if I look at the tribal conflicts between rival chimp tribes, or if I look at the tribal conflicts between different species, or if I look at human war, to me it's all the same thing, which is the attempt to complexify and survive. That's it. That's at like the root of all existence.
So is a bonobo thinking to himself, okay, guys, we got to complexify and survive, or
no, it's probably subconscious.
Well, why would you assume it's subconscious? Now it's something else. You're still necessarily implying a cognitive function.
Organism became a multi-celled organism.
No, but when you say something subconscious, what you're talking about is there's still a part of its mind that is conceptualizing this particular thing. It's just doing so outside of the awareness of the ego, right?
Then sub-material, sub-life, its programming, but I don't know how to say it. It's on a DNA level.
The point I'm getting at here is that if you're trying to point to the behavior of other animals in order to justify the behavior of human animals, when human animals have an immeasurably more complex, even when the activities at the surface level appear the same, there's an immeasurably more complex cognitive set of events taking place underneath it. To say that the one is identical with the other in either direction is simply mistaken.
It's not really saying identical.
Okay, I have a question.
Tyler,
I don't want to get wrapped around. I don't want to get wrapped around a spoke and then talk about this for another hour, because what are we hitting? We're at like 9:40 right now. I do want to dip out in like probably 20 minutes or so. I do want to keep it at a tight 2 hours. Okay, I'm a busy man.
I'm having
okay,
fun. I
so-
hit my second win, so I'm
well,
on
y'all,
my death run.
y'all can continue after I go, but I'm going to try to keep it for at least my presence for 20 minutes. So what I'm going to ask you, I think this is the question that's at the heart of the issue. Okay. And I forgot it. Fuck. Oh, okay. So let's take just humanity. Okay. Just humanity. Do you think, based off of our history and what we can imagine about the future, that we can socially evolve past 1, a state, and 2, war?
Socially evolve past war?
War or conflict?
Well, I mean, we've
past a state.
I mean, as if to illustrate my point earlier, we've done so at multiple levels already. For example, we no longer wage war at the level of cities. That's a thing that's more or less concluded as far as the entire Western world, at least, is concerned. We no longer wage war.
I was about to say, as a species, there's obviously 21st century examples that contradict that, but yeah, it's not a rule. It's the exception.
It's more because of the overall organizations have switched
War is
from
also,
like city states to nation
well, yeah,
states.
but
war is
what's
also the exception to human affairs anyways.
If you
is
fall into
it?
these
Whoa,
same
slow down, cowboy. Because if war is the exception to human affairs generally, then it can't be something that is primary to us at the natural level. This is now becomes,
Why?
Well, because it's an event that's conditional on particular circumstances that are historically contingent, and in our cases, they are historically contingent on the existence of particular institutions doing particular kinds of things.
Let me analogize it so we don't get wrapped around another spoke.
Okay.
The act of shitting is a naturally necessary act. Okay.
Sure,
However,
but the act of
I am
pondering
not
because your head is
constantly
rested on your
shitting.
hand while you're shitting is not, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
But I'm trying to make a different point. My different point is that the act of shitting is not a constant. It's necessary. It's a part of your natural function. But I shit, if I'm lucky, once a day or once every 2 days. 99.9% of my time is not spent shitting.
But the process.
And so what I'm saying is,
but the process that gives the process that but the process that gives rise to shitting is not like war. We do not, for example, have to do war as an act of collective shitting, so to speak.
I think we absolutely do. As a matter of fact, I think it's almost a perfect analogy.
I think we don't understand really why wars fucking keep continuously happening, because we seem to have all the wars.
Why would you presume that they wouldn't? No. I think this follows almost perfectly. Like the situations for conflict arising are almost happening, unfolding around us at all times. There are tribal groups that want power. There are tribal groups that have adverse interest. There are nation states that have adverse interest. Some of them are armed. Some of them are not armed. Some of them are constantly fighting in order to get more money, power, and weapons. And then it's only when a certain group has enough money, power, and weapons that they believe that they can overpower another group that war occurs. So there's a huge buildup leading to conflict.
Well, no, because
saying that war arises out of nowhere
analogy goes hard as
wrong.
fuck, bro.
The shitting analogy.
What the soul needs is more fiber.
I mean, it kind of does. So you take consistent shits. Yeah.
Okay.
Shitting is a part of metabolism. When we're talking about war, we're talking about collectivities that understand themselves as cohesive units that are contesting for specific things in the world that they have become accustomed to requiring. And often these things are required not because there's actually an organic need that impresses itself upon them, but because they have acculturated themselves to valuing X, Y, and Z that now becomes an object of competition for two groups. But that's not natural, though. That's actually the definition of artifice, right? That's like... Beg your pardon?
Why isn't it?
What do you mean, why isn't it?
No, I think... Hold on. Let me hop in right here.
Okay.
You made a mistake in your analogy, Connor. It was conflict is inevitable to some degree. However, war being the unique resolution for it is kind of like shitting your pants. You will have to resolve conflict because, like, we have conflict right now. However, war is extraordinary because we have failed to solve conflict, which naturally arises through diplomacy, through discussion, through compromise, and instead have arrived at the worst possible.
But even
outcome,
if we're talking about so President Sunday was talking about something that I think is actually pertinent to our exact moment with the energy crisis and the technology crisis that we're facing right now. Okay, the Western world technically doesn't need petroleum, right? We could give it up.
No, the Western world does need petroleum, but the Western world needs petroleum as a function.
We absolutely we need it like crazy.
It needs, but it needs
culture
real bad.
And its artifice.
The Western world,
roads are literally made out of it.
The Western world is not an emanation from nature. It's not an organic being that hungers for petroleum. The Western world is itself one with the consumption of petroleum.
Okay.
So
hold on. As a collective of conscious beings, correct me if I'm wrong, the scramble and fight for petroleum between multiple tribal entities that believe themselves to be one thing or conceptualize themselves as one thing, we do not have to enter into armed conflict. We could actually reorganize ourselves in order to no longer need this thing.
Well, we not only do not reorganize ourselves to no longer need this thing, we also don't enter into armed conflict as collectivities to obtain these things. What actually happens is you have an administrative structure that is recognized via abstraction by a large group of people, which gives it the power and authority to draw from them, which then makes decisions and takes on those actions. This is why you, Connor, are not consulted at any level about, for example, what the head of your military or what your country does abroad. Like there's not an organic need from which these actions follow. It is an institution that has its own needs apart from any organic needs that makes these decisions.
I don't agree with this because I think that the demands, particularly within like liberal democracies or whatever, are the demands of the market. And the demands of the market, simplified, are the cumulative demands of the people. We create our own demand.
Why would you assume so?
Because I'm talking to you on a plastic computer fueled with, rare earth minerals collected from Africa. And not only that, it was probably assembled in, Asia. And if somebody took this away from me, like the computer or my smartphone or any of that kind of stuff, I would view this as a steep drop in the quality of my life.
No, but why would you assume that the decisionistic outcomes in a democracy are downstream from the market? You live in a two-party system in which people have to make decisions against their own interests and values precisely because the system as such is arrayed as a consequence of a series of historical events to actually not translate out what they need or what the market needs directly. Unfortunately,
I agree with you. But what we would need in order for the market to not dominate American politics or American foreign policy is people with principles who are willing to override the gluttonous appetite of Western markets.
Oh, but I mean, that's hardly enough. No, that's hardly enough, though, because here's what you're up against. When you're dealing with, for example, let's take your political system as a case study. The market would determine what the felt interests are of the aggregate of different bodies, right? There's a shortage of X. People find X is more expensive. X is more expensive to produce. X is harder to get a hold of. Somebody promises X, therefore they win. But here's the problem. You now have a situation where you have a society that is stratified by various sub-collectivities that have their own interest that is opposite that of the whole. So, for example, you have people divided along not just on class lines, but also on party lines. And often, this is something that Michel talks about. Robert Michel talks about. Now you have sub-organizations that, quote-unquote, represent the interests of broader organizations that have their own interest apart from those, their own interest apart from each other, and once they're in power, their own interest apart from the very seat that they're occupying, because they want to remain there. At what level does the market actually manage to bleed through and be translated out into the activities of the state? Well, it doesn't seem to, because the activities of the state are now being determined by a group that necessarily has its interest apart from the market.
I don't agree at all. So what you kind of described, I was with you for 99% of the trip. You lost me at the last 1%.
Okay.
So when you're talking about all these conflicting interests, when you're talking about corporations, lobbying groups, PACs, political parties, all that kind of stuff, who all have their communal and individual self-interest, and some of these things are really conflicting at all times. Like, the way that I see this borne out in American policy is not just the conversations that we have between like binary choices, but also in the conversations that we don't have. Like, American hegemony is a presumption of the natural state of order of the globe. Like, Donald Trump is an aberration in the fact that he talks about isolationism. Almost every other politician who exists in the United States of America presumes American hegemony on the global stage.
But he was the president.
He was, well, and that's because
his decisions, by dint of being the president, his decisions became the decisions of America. Right?
And what I would say is that if you talk, and what I would say is if you talk to any one of Trump's fans, they would say that he was undermined at every possible turn to affect his policy because his policies ran contrary to the collective financial and political interest of the United States of America, of both parties.
And yet, nonetheless, it is perfectly possible for him to use his authority when he's in that position to confound the ability of the market in order to actually frustrate him at, for example, a domestic level. Like, for instance, he could attempt, as indeed he did, to make it impossible for certain, like, threads of academic discourse to be taught in public schools, to make the opposition, the political opposition, unintelligible to the younger generation. Well, at that point, the market isn't dictating what the state does. In fact, if he was successful in this, the market actually would be directly what was being attacked by the state itself.
But we're talking about perverse interests, and so, for instance, like, if you thought that the education,
we're talking about the existence of perverse interests. If you're going to like interests are upstream of what we do. So if there are interests that are not synonymous or not synchronous with what the interests of the market are, or what interests the market would make us feel as a collective, if there are interests that the group that makes decisions has opposed to that, well, then you can no longer say that the market is actually what gives rise to the decisions of a state, because they're opposed.
Powers? If you wanted to say, I agree with you. I agree with you here, particularly, I think, with states that have a higher level of historical, like, governance that can be viewed as separate from the market. I am talking about the United States of America, but I think that you could probably come up with a dozen to 24 European examples where the leaders and the parliamentary systems and all that kind of stuff have acted in opposition to the market. So if you're saying not necessarily so, and I'm being overly broad or general about how big of an impact the market has in the United States, then that could be true. The only reason why I've appealed to the market of the United States, I suppose, is because it is the most powerful country on the planet. It does have the most powerful military.
Oh, the market of the United States. Well, that doesn't make sense. The market of the United States is not the market. The market of the United States is a specific constrained set of institutions and behaviors of a specific populace that it communicates with things outside of it, right? So you're not talking about the market anymore as this like broad human entity that pushes back against like irrational like decisions or whatnot. Now you're specifically talking about something that is contained by the state.
I think it's largely an irrational animal.
Well, I mean, it has to be rational. It gives rise to specific outcomes based according to a specific logic, right? So it's intrinsically rational. That's kind of the point. It's a rational basis for determining the viability of decisions or for behavior.
I don't think my desire for cheap consumer products is irrational. I don't think it's a well thought out position.
What?
I don't think it's a weighed option.
It's not really what I mean by rational, but the point I'm getting at here. I mean, here's an easy pushback to you. There are these things in American politics that make who's in power and what they can do immune to fluctuations at the level of the market. For example, presidents are in office for terms, and during those terms, there is not like an ongoing electoral process that is pushing people out who don't follow broader social or market trends and putting other people in who do.
Sorry, I'm trying to let's see if we can boil down to a point, because I'm actually not quite sure what we're fighting on.
Okay.
So are you saying that the state is not always acting in the market? What is your broad overarching point? What do you think that I've said that's wrong that you want to correct me on that you think is correct?
I think the line that is being drawn.
The market is not the vehicle for the state?
No, the market is not the vehicle for the state. I would actually argue the state is the vehicle for the market, but leaving that aside.
Okay.
And I thought that's what your argument was earlier as well, because that's what it secures, right? Even Hayek would agree with this. But the point I'm getting at is that the through line from the collectivity of the state down to collectivities of human beings or pre-humans, I think that's fallacious, and it comes from looking from the top down at the state level of what we see when we see humans operating in concert at various levels of abstraction, and then seeing at the level of like, we see like a similar spatial arrangement of organisms doing a spatially similar kind of thing. Therefore, it's the same thing. Therefore, we can use our placement of this down here as a byway of valorizing that as something natural. I think that's deeply mistaken. I think the reason why we were bringing up the market in the first place, this is how I interpreted your line of argumentation, was to point out that there was some kind of process that was in some way immune to contingent factors of culture that commonly drives the activities of both states and of quote unquote tribes. But I don't think that thing drives either.
Okay. I have an explanation, but I don't want to get spun around the wheel, so to speak.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the driver of human behavior within these collections of institution states, corporations, etc.?
I think it's multiple to the extreme. I think every single one is a collection of innumerable private interests that blend with each other, that contradict each other, that contradict even the ones that they sit in. So, for example, a person, it's not just like parties have their own self-interest. Human beings in parties have their own self-interest. Maybe they don't disclose their political values that are like, what, in order to, you see what I'm saying?
I do. And I think that if we were getting back to our previous argument where you're taking human categorization, you're being overly broad, you're projecting your worldview onto other things that might not be actually reflected in those things that might not be reality, I can follow this line of argumentation. But the truth is that we, relatively speaking, are agents operating in a world, in categorization, in organization, in generalization, help us operate at higher levels that allow us to achieve more money, more power, more time, more sex, more whatever you're trying to get. So what I'm asking is, you're saying that it's almost incomprehensibly complex and that the motivations of so many people are so incomprehensible that we are creating these categorizations, but these categorizations are basically ethereal. So my question to you is, how do you even operate with such an understanding of the environment?
You work a lot harder. So it's not simply the case that we give up trying to understand things through concepts, but we recognize that our concepts, just like the rest of our organism, has a history. I.e., we evolved to get all of those things that you mentioned, and our perception evolved both at the level of the species and at the level of the individual to identify those things that you mentioned as the things that we want and need to thrive and whatnot. But they didn't evolve for truth. That being said, we are also aware of the contingency of of our like concept ensembles and things like that. And so we are able to do violence to them, break them apart, and open them up a little bit more. And conceive of things that, for example, may be unintuitive, but may also be true. And this is actually going to sort of flatter your position a little bit, because I know you're a fan of Burke. Burke will argue something to the effect of like, the explosive violence of the French Revolution, despite being motivated by a drive for more and more freedom, will actually have the perverse effect of delimiting your freedom, actually. But that's not intuitive. What's intuitive is, bad guy over there, we good guy, we beat bad guy, now things better. And yet that may be true. So what you do is you fine-grain your analysis a lot more. You don't take for granted the outer membrane of these social institutions that are sort of like part and parcel of our discourse. You point out that actually these lines that we've drawn here, not only are some of them permeable, some of them are incoherent. Some of them bleed over with other things and involve them in ways that make them not really appropriate to talk about as separate. And if we talk about them as separate and independent, we actually blind ourselves to actual processes that involve both.
So, okay, I want to bring up an example because I think it's pertinent, and not only is it pertinent, I think that it speaks to our geopolitics, what's happening now, and probably why we're coming to different solutions to the same problem. So, when I think of the Western world, again, conception, I do think of material development. I do think of access to public education. I think of mixed economy capitalism. I think of liberal democracies on different gradations of authoritarianism.
But if I may, just to furnish your conception a little bit more before you continue, so you sort of get where I'm coming from. What you do not include, however, which you really should though, is the vast economic engine of the transatlantic slave trade that made so many of these things actually economically viable. It's actually part and parcel. Even leaving aside the ethicality of it, that now becomes an essential part of the development of these institutions. So now you have to be a little bit careful. Like you're conceiving of...
Sorry, continue.
No, but you're talking about, like, when you think of Western society, you think of these outcroppings of this larger organism that you associate with it, but there's a deeper level to it. There are, like, the very large processes that conditioned these things. That didn't just make them possible, made them the most likely outcome. And if you're conceiving of things only at the surface level and ignoring that, then you're kind of engaging, like, sort of two-dimensionally with something. You're trying to, like, understand a cancer, say, by reference to the outer shape of the tumor.
Okay. So with these developments, though, like the level of analysis that you're kind of asking me to go to, I guess, is almost like a godlike level of analysis. And the reason why I say this is because I've done a lot of things in my life, I know how difficult the most simple of attempts to do anything are. And so as a result, you say, like, oh, the transatlantic slave trade is an example of, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but it's this presumably bad moral horror that created the material conditions that birthed this world that I actually do view as positive. Now, the thing about that
it's a little bit worse. It wasn't a given necessarily that we would even view it as a horror.
Sure.
Yeah.
So but here's the thing is, I can go back. This is what we do with, like, the Nazi experiments and all that kind of shit. And I can bring up, like, the 10,000 things that were learned through the moral horror that now impact our world on a day-to-day basis that probably save millions of lives. So then you can't just look at, like, the spoiled fruit or the spoiled whatever the fuck you want to call it, the cancer or the tumor or the genesis of the tumor or whatever. You also have to look at what it created. And the truth is that on balance, I'm looking at the way that human beings conduct their lives. I don't see a materially, spiritually, intellectually, philosophically better alternative compared to what exists now in the Western liberal world.
I mean, if you're pointing to the fact that we would be foolish to throw away the hard-won fruits of human endeavor, regardless of how horrible we regard them now, I mean, obviously, I agree with you 100%. But
even if we were to look at, like, China or West Africa or the Middle East and North Africa or any of our, like, rivals in, like, a cultural sense, I don't see a better system.
You think they're rivals?
Yeah.
They have the exact same administrative structure, more or less, like, barring, like, tiny details. Like, in terms of the...
You think China does?
I mean, compared to the United States, the experience of an American living in America is going to be radically different from someone in China, certainly in terms of political freedom and things of that sort. However, in terms of, like, the actual, like, formal constitution and structure of its institutions and things like that, it's by design entirely Western. This is not a native development out of China. This is a thing that was literally explicitly modeled off of Western European states.
We're now talking about the post-Maoist communist China?
Even Maoist, actually. Like across pre-Maoist even.
is this not evidence? So hold on. So now I have to ask what the point is again. So is the point that it's all emanating from the West? Like is that not evidence of the power of the ideas and the powers of the organization and the powers of the institution?
The point is that it is not required of you to onboard the exact same assumptions that gave rise to a certain global situation in order to learn from it and benefit from it and even take hold of the things that it produced that you think are good and continue to benefit from them into the future. Like, so, for example, it was probably required at some point that there was an unstable slave society in some ancient Greek city-state that made democracy possible, but that doesn't mean you need to hold on to the divisions of society that made slavery a thing.
Sure, yeah. But do you have an example of an institution that I am holding on to that you think is like particularly pernicious?
Well, pernicious is a complicated term because now we're presuming other things with it to say that it's harmful. But I would say the subject of the argument broadly here has been the state itself. And I think if you're essentializing, if you're taking let's say a purely policy framework and subordinating all political discussion to what should the state do as sort of a presumption, I think that is pernicious because it's barring off a myriad other possibilities.
Okay.
Well, then what I would say
my
is...
chat is dying to know your guys' opinions on Yakub. They want to know about two things. Albanians versus Serbians, who would win, who deserves to win, and why is it Albania? And two, what is your opinion on our shared white devil ancestry?
Okay,
I'm sorry.
So answering these questions because I do have to leave momentarily. So number one, the reason why it's going to be Albanians is because Serbians always bite off more than they can chew. So basically, they would piss off everyone by attacking the Croats and the Bosniaks and the Albanians all at the same time, and then everyone would come together.
Correct answer.
Yeah, and then everybody would come together in order to kick the shit out of the Serbs. I don't think it's because of Albanian supremacy. I think it's just because Serbs are really good at pissing everybody off. And then when it comes to Yakub, he created the white race. I'm a big fan. I'm white. So, realistically, he created Shane Gillis and the TV show Tires. So ultimately, Yakub is responsible for some pretty great things.
Lord, it is time. The world is ripe for the harvest.
Solid exit.
All right. Anyways, so actually, I wouldn't mind continuing this conversation.
We can continue it later. We don't need to. I'm exhausted as well, so we can absolutely continue this another time too.
Okay, then to be continued on. Is the state necessary? But I am going to go take care of my children and go to bed. But Tyler, thank you for inspiring this conversation. Thank you for coming along on artistic posting, and President Sunday, thank you for your hosting.
You're very welcome. Thanks. It's a fun discussion.
All right.
Have a good break. Later. Take care.